Welcome to our lecture series on anthropological thought. Today, we are diving into the evolutionary school, a foundational framework that shaped the early days of cultural anthropology. We will explore how early scholars attempted to reconstruct the history of human society, the methodologies they used, and how their ideas evolved over time. The evolutionary school of anthropological thought came into being during the second half of the 19th century, right around the time Charles Darwin's theory of the origin of species was gaining immense popularity. Because of this timing, there is often confusion about whether Darwinism directly influenced cultural evolutionism. Scholars are actually divided on this. Some argue that since the biological development of the hominidae family is a minimum condition for culture, cultural evolution mirrors Darwinian biological evolution. However, scholars like Taggart strongly point out that Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, appeared too late to have a foundational effect on the cultural evolutionary schemes. Pioneers of cultural evolution were already planning and writing their major works between 1861 and 1865, simultaneously with Darwin's own research. So, what was the core premise of these early cultural anthropologists? Pioneers across Britain, America, and Germany used the evolutionary scheme as a methodology to reconstruct the cultural history of mankind. They popularized a massive assumption that the history of social institutions and human culture was a witness to successive sequential development. They believed that the present developed stage of mankind was the result of progressive changes over time. Crucially, they argued that the direction of this evolution was always from simple to complex, from a state of homogeneity to heterogeneity, and from the indefinite to the definite. This brings us to a fascinating concept, the unilinear sequence of cultural evolution. These scholars noticed similarities in cultures around the world that had absolutely no known historical connections. How did they explain this? They attributed it to the mental unity or psychic unity of mankind. They argued that humans possess a similar mentality, and when faced with similar environmental conditions, they will think and react in similar ways. Therefore, different cultural groups, starting as hunters and gatherers in isolated parts of the world, would independently develop their material and non-material culture, passing through the exact same historical sequences, such as savagery, barbarism, and civilization. This applied not just to technology, but to institutions like marriage, family, property, and law. It is important to note that these great pioneers were not trained anthropologists in the modern sense. They were essentially armchair scholars who relied on their critical minds and secondary data supplied by travelers, businessmen, and missionaries. Their primary method was comparing the present civilized stage of man with earlier stages. But what happened when they lacked sufficient information about the past? They turned to what they called survivals. Survivals were uncommon cultural traits or customs that had lost their functional importance in the present day, but were highly significant as remnants or traces of earlier stages of cultural development. By analyzing these survivals, they successfully established evolutionary stages in a historical perspective. Among these pioneers, E.B. Tylor is widely regarded as the greatest, largely because he established anthropology as a separate academic discipline at Oxford University in 1884. Across the Atlantic, his great contemporary L.H. Morgan enthusiastically contributed vast amounts of information on the development of family and kinship systems. However, their unilinear evolutionary schemes faced heavy criticism later on. Diffusionists and 20th century cultural relativists attacked the ideas of psychic unity and a single unilinear pattern of evolution. Using historical and empirical data, these critics emphasized cultural diversities caused by local environments, arguing that the course of cultural development was actually divergent and interconnected, rather than parallel and isolated. Despite the heavy criticism, evolutionary schemes were revived in the 20th century by scholars we now call neo-evolutionists or modern evolutionists. Leslie White in America and V. Gordon Childe in Britain took the criticisms of classical evolutionism into account and postulated a universal evolutionary scheme. They shifted the frame of reference from particular cultures to culture in general. Meanwhile, Julian Stewart propounded a multilinear approach, which moved away from universal stages and instead searched for parallels of limited occurrence. Later, Stewart and White students Marshall Solins and Elman Service reconciled these views by proposing that evolutionary data should be placed into two broad categories: general evolution and specific evolution. To better understand this landscape, we can classify the evolutionary school into two main groups based on their doctrines: the classical evolutionary school and the neo-evolutionary school. As you can see on this chart, the classical school is subdivided by nationality. The British school includes Tylor, Maine, McLennan, and Fraser. The American school was led solely by Morgan. The German school was pioneered by Beethoven and Bastian. Similarly, the neo-evolutionary school is divided into the British school, pioneered by V. Gordon Childe, and the American school, supported by Leslie White and Julian Stewart. Before we delve into the specific contributions of these scholars, we must define our terms. What exactly is evolution? Broadly, it is defined as a process in which different forms are produced or developed orderly within a system. It is concerned with continuous progress that brings complexity out of simplicity, heterogeneity out of homogeneity, and certainty out of uncertainty. It deals with changes within a system over time, moving stage after stage. The direction is always from simple to complex. The British sociologist Herbert Spencer famously defined it as the integration of matter passing from an indefinite coherent homogeneity to a definite coherent heterogeneity. This principle applies to both biological and cultural spheres. When we apply this to culture, cultural evolution is defined as the process by which different successive forms in sociocultural institutions, or the culture of mankind as a whole, are developed and accumulated over time in a continuous manner. Evolutionists use this as a methodological approach to reconstruct history. This methodology relies on two vital assumptions. First, that genuine cultural parallels developed independently in all cultures in historical sequences. Second, that these parallels occurred independently due to the psychic unity of mankind. Ultimately, cultural evolution is avowedly scientific and generalizing. It is a quest for cultural similarities, parallels, and regularities across human history. It is crucial to distinguish cultural evolution from biological evolution, as there is a tendency to view the former as just an extension of the latter. While the biological development of hominidae was a precondition for culture, cultural development is only analogous to biology in a chronological sense. In biological evolution, all forms are genetically related, and development is essentially divergent or convergent. True parallels are rare. In cultural evolution, however, the assumption is that cultural patterns in different parts of the world are genetically unrelated, yet they pass through parallel sequences. Classical evolutionists consider divergent trends, caused by local environments, to be of only secondary importance. Different scholars highlighted these distinctions in various ways. The British neo-evolutionist V.G. Childe distinguished the two by stressing the divergent nature of biological evolution compared to the frequent operation of diffusion and convergence in cultural evolution. While both share analogies, like a tendency toward increasing complexity and the development of superior forms or progress, they operate differently. The American anthropologist A.L. Kroeber provided a brilliant distinction. He argued that the process of cultural evolution is additive and accumulative, meaning we build upon past culture, whereas organic, biological evolution is substitutive, where new traits replace old ones. As evolutionary theory was revived in the 20th century, Julian Stewart attempted to organize the various approaches into a clear typology. He suggested that data related to cultural evolution can be placed into three distinct categories: unilinear cultural evolution, universal cultural evolution, and multilinear cultural evolution. Let's examine each of these approaches in detail. The first type, unilinear cultural evolution, represents the classical 19th century approach. This scheme deals with unilinear sequences, parallel inventions, and the psychic unity of mankind. It postulates that all cultures of the world pass through the exact same successive developmental stages in a continuous line. As a result of this journey, simple forms inevitably change into complex ones, and homogeneity moves toward heterogeneity. The second type is universal cultural evolution. This is essentially a modern revamping of the unilinear approach, championed by neo-evolutionists like Leslie White and V. Gordon Childe. Instead of looking at particular individual cultures, universal evolution is concerned with the evolution of the culture of mankind as a whole, included as irrelevant to the macro-level progress of humanity. The third type, multilinear cultural evolution, was propounded by Julian Stewart himself. It is a somewhat less ambitious but more precise approach than the other two. While it still deals with developmental sequences, it is distinctive because it searches for independent discoveries or parallels of limited occurrence, rather than sweeping universals. Its methodology is empirical rather than deductive. Stewart did not expect that all historical data could be neatly classified into universal stages. Because it deals with specific, limited parallels, the outstanding methodological problem of multilinear evolution is creating an appropriate taxonomy to classify these diverse cultural phenomena.
To reconcile the differing views of White's universal evolution and Stewart's multilinear evolution, their students, Marshall Solins and Elman Service, developed the concepts of specific and general evolution. They argued that evolution in both biological and cultural spheres actually moves simultaneously in two directions. On one side, it creates diversity through adaptive modifications. On the other side, it generates progress, where higher forms arise and surpass lower ones. They opined that specific and general evolution are not different realities, but rather two aspects or contexts of the same total evolutionary process.
Let's break these down. Specific cultural evolution is the study of the development of local cultures or groups of cultures through relatively short periods of time. The keynote here is cultural diversity. This diversity is brought about by localized factors such as specific environments, diffusion of traits, and local inventions. The study of specific evolution employs phylogenetic classification, which is concerned with tracing specific lines of descent. It views change purely from the perspective of local adaptation, recognizing that specific cultures arise, proliferate, or become extinct, leaving behind a highly complex, entangled evolutionary path.
Conversely, general cultural evolution is the study of successive forms through long periods of time. For example, tracking the shift from hunting and gathering bands to agriculturalists to the Industrial Revolution and into the Atomic Age. The keynote of general evolution is progress, objectively measured. Here, the emphasis shifts away from specific family trees and instead focuses on the character of progress itself. Forms are classed in broad stages or levels of development without reference to specific phylogeny. In this perspective, all those local diversities we just talked about merge into larger overarching patterns that unfold in a progressive fashion. Now, let's return to the classical evolutionary theory and examine its basic postulates. Although heavily criticized later, these classical evolutionarists were groundbreaking. They were the first and foremost thinkers to declare that the concept of racial superiority was a psychological myth. For them, primitive or tribal societies were not inferior species, but rather the ancestors of modern civilized societies, representing an earlier stage of humanity that everyone had evolved from. They seriously aimed at showing that mankind was a unity. They used what was known as the historical method, relying on historical explanations to show that human culture had undergone progressive and cumulative change. Because they were studying the deep past, these scholars faced a major problem, the absence of written records. To fill in these massive gaps, their critical minds devised the concept of survivals. Survivals were defined as uncommon customs or practices that had lost their original significance or function in the present day, but held valuable meaning in the past. By identifying these residues of primitive stages within higher, modern stages of culture, anthropologists could use them as indicators to reconstruct the conditions of mankind in earlier unrecorded periods. Alongside survivals, they heavily relied on the comparative method. They compared the early stages of contemporary primitive peoples with civilized societies, assuming that the former were a direct reflection of the early conditions of the latter. They compared both material and non-material survivals to establish a clear sequence of development. As always, this sequence moved from simple to complex, from homogeneity to heterogeneity, and from uncertainty to certainty. This systematic comparison of cultures and cultural institutions across the world became known as the comparative method of cultural evolutionists. One of the biggest puzzles these evolutionists face was explaining why isolated people around the world had similar culture traits and patterns. Was it diffusion, ideas spreading from one group to another? They didn't think diffusion was a convincing enough explanation for everything. Instead, they postulated cultural parallelism. They argued that genetically unrelated humans made independent inventions and parallel discoveries. Why? Because of the psychic unity of mankind, the idea that all human beings possess a similar mentality and will react and think similarly when faced with similar environmental situations. This explains why agriculture was invented simultaneously in Asia and America, why the concept of zero appeared independently in Hindu, Babylonian, and Maya cultures, and why paper and printing were invented independently in the East and West. To summarize the classical unilinear approach, we can look at 6 salient features. 1. Human culture evolves in a single unilinear sequence, stage after stage. 2. The direction is always from simple to complex. 3. These stages are established using historical speculation and the comparative method. 4. Global cultural similarities are caused by the psychic unity of mankind and parallel inventions. 5. Local cultural diversities are considered insignificant to the grand scheme. And 6. Higher stages of culture contain survivals that remind us of earlier primitive stages. Moving on to the specific contributions of these classical evolutionists, let's look at Lewis Henry Morgan. While Tyler didn't place specific cultures into rigid stages, Morgan famously postulated that mankind as a whole passed through 3 massive stages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. He went further by subdividing both savagery and barbarism into lower, middle, and upper statuses. By comparing tools and levels of subsistence, Morgan attempted to trace the exact developmental stages of all humankind. Let's break down Morgan's substages, starting with savagery. Lower savagery began with the development of language and subsisting on gathered fruits and nuts. It ended with the use of fire and fishing. Morgan noted there were no living examples of this stage. Middle savagery continued with fishing and fire, but ended with a major technological leap, the invention of the bow and arrow. During this time, mankind expanded across the earth. Morgan placed Australians and Polynesians at the time of European contact in this stage. Upper savagery featured the bow and arrow, and ended with the invention of pottery, exemplified by certain Native American tribes in the western subarctic and Columbia River Valley. Next is barbarism. Lower barbarism witnessed the continuation of pottery and ended with the domestication of animals in the Eastern Hemisphere, and plant cultivation with adobe brick architecture in the Western Hemisphere. Middle barbarism saw widespread animal domestication and agriculture, ending with the monumental invention of iron ore smelting. Morgan cited the Pueblo Indians and village-dwelling Indians of Mexico as examples. Upper barbarism was characterized by iron smelting and ended with the invention of the phonetic alphabet and written literature, with examples being the Grecian tribes of the Homeric Age and the Germanic tribes during Julius Caesar's time. Finally, the stage of civilization began with the phonetic alphabet and literary writing. It is very important to note that Morgan and Tyler's use of words like savagery and barbarism are considered highly offensive today and have been dropped by present-day anthropologists. Today, we use terms like hunting and food-gathering societies, horticultural tribals, and pre-state societies. However, the underlying historical sequence they proposed, moving from hunting and gathering to the domestication of plants and animals, and recognizing writing as the beginning of civilization, has been broadly accepted. These evolutionists didn't just look at technology, they also tried to establish the historical sequence of social institutions like marriage and kinship. Scholars like Tyler, Morgan, McLennan, and Balcofen postulated that the earliest stage of human relations was sexual promiscuity. From this, society evolved through group marriage, then polyandry, and finally arrived at present-day monogamy. Furthermore, they all agreed that early societies were matriarchal and matrilocal. They believed that the patriarchal family and patrilocal residence evolved much later. Therefore, in early kinship organizations, descent was traced through the female line, with patrilineal descent developing only in the course of time. Morgan specifically theorized that the family system passed through 15 successive stages of development, starting with the consanguineal family and ending with the monogamous family. He also noted that in kinship terminology, a broad classificatory system preceded a more specific descriptive system. There was one notable exception among the pioneers regarding this sequence, H.J.S. Maine. Maine's sequence of family organization revealed that patriarchy was actually the early stage, preceding matriarchy. However, this view was not acceptable to the other evolutionists of his time, though his other sequences, like moving from status to contract, were widely accepted. When it came to the realm of belief, E.B. Tyler took an enthusiastic interest in establishing the historical sequences of religion. He theorized a clear, unilinear path. He was of the opinion that animism, which is the fundamental belief in spiritual beings or souls, was the earliest stage of religion. From animism, society developed polytheism, the belief in multiple gods, which eventually evolved into the present stage of monotheism, the belief in a single god. This unilinear evolutionary approach was applied to almost every aspect of human life. In economic organization, the stages moved from hunting and gathering to domestication to industrial labor. In technology, they recognized the successive development of the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. In the field of art, A.C. Haddon established 3 successive stages, starting with realistic art, moving to symbolic, and finally geometric. And famously, J.G. Fraser argued that human society's understanding of the world passed through 3 successive stages, beginning with magic, evolving into religion, and finally arriving at science. To truly understand this school of thought, we must look closer at its greatest pioneer, Edward Burnett Tyler.
Born in Camberwell, England in 1832, Tyler was raised in a prosperous Quaker family. Because of his Quaker faith, he was barred from attending traditional English universities, which required tests of religious orthodoxy. Instead, he entered the family brass foundry business at age 16. However, his health began to fail, and in 1855, he traveled to Cuba to recover. It was there, on a Havana bus, that a chance encounter with a fellow Quaker named Henry Christie would entirely change the trajectory of his life and the field of anthropology itself. We will explore exactly how that happened and dive deeper into Tyler's specific contributions in our next session. Moving right into the pivotal moments of E.B. Tyler, his journey took an unexpected turn in 1856. After working in his family's business from the age of 16, his health began to fail at 23. Advised to travel for his well-being, he found himself in Cuba. There, a chance encounter on a Havana bus changed anthropological history. He heard a passenger using the Quaker pronoun thou, introduced himself, and met Henry Christie, a prominent archaeologist who would give direction to Tyler's life.
Christie persuaded Tyler to join an archaeological expedition to Mexico. Under Christie's expert guidance, Tyler developed a keen eye for observation. He paid close attention not just to material remains, but to the rites, customs, and beliefs of contemporary Mexican people. He noticed striking similarities between extant customs and ancient ones. For example, he observed Mexican penitents scourging themselves in church, which immediately reminded him of an identical rite from the ancient Egyptian festival of Isis. This specific observation was foundational to his later highly influential theory of cultural survivals. Another major problem that fascinated Tyler during this Mexican expedition was the debate between independent origin and diffusion. Did cultural institutions arise independently in different places, or did they spread from a single source? To approach this complex issue, Tyler employed a cautious methodology that would characterize much of his later work, stating that if you weigh the difficulties on both sides of the question, they will nearly balance out. Although Tyler was only in Mexico for 6 months, that short expedition cemented his devotion to founding a science of culture. His subsequent work in cultural evolution attracted wide recognition, effectively establishing anthropology as an independent scientific field of study in Europe. He championed the discipline so fiercely that his contemporaries half-jokingly called it Mr. Tyler's science. His efforts did not go unrewarded. He secured Britain's first recognized university post in the field as the keeper of the University Museum at Oxford, and later in 1884 became a reader in anthropology there. Before diving into his major publications, it is worth noting Tyler's character. He was a commanding, benevolent figure, known for his simplicity, patience, and quiet humor. Because he left school at 16 and never formally returned as a student, his writings were refreshingly free from academic jargon, making his ideas highly accessible. In his personal life, he married Anna in 1858. Their 59-year marriage was regarded as a model partnership, with Lady Tyler actively supporting his academic endeavors and regularly attending his lectures. Tyler's first book, Anahuac, published in 1861, discussed the cultural history of Mexico. Here, he formally introduced his concept of survivals. He defined survivals as processes, customs, or opinions that persist purely by force of habit, long after they have lost their original utility. Therefore, they act as historical proof of an earlier cultural condition. A classic example he cited is saying "God bless you" when someone sneezes. This custom survives from an ancient belief that a sneeze was the soul trying to escape the body, and the blessing was meant to counter that danger. In 1865, Tyler published his second book, Researches into the Early History of Mankind. This work tackled the progressive theory of cultural development, rooted in the idea that the human mind is fundamentally similar across different groups. The central question that perplexed him was whether the vast differences between so-called civilized and savage societies were due to the progress of civilized groups or the degeneration of savage ones. By comparing cultural survivals, Tyler concluded firmly that culture as a whole had progressed, not degenerated. Based on his evaluation of this cultural progress, Tyler outlined a unilinear sequence of human history. He proposed that present civilization has evolved through 3 successive stages of cultural development. Mankind began in a state of savagery, which was the earliest stage. From there, societies progressed into barbarism and finally emerged into civilization. This 3-stage model became a cornerstone of 19th-century evolutionary anthropology. To answer why completely isolated cultures across the world shared similar traits, like having language, religion, and marriage, Tyler rejected the idea that these traits simply diffused from a single origin point. Instead, he relied on the concept of the psychic unity of mankind. This principle suggests that because all human minds are fundamentally similar, people will independently invent similar solutions when faced with similar environmental conditions. Therefore, he argued, differences between cultures are merely differences in their stage of development, not differences in their fundamental kind or origin.
Tyler provided fascinating examples to back up this theory of independent invention. He pointed out parallel cultural traits among peoples with absolutely no known historical connections. For instance, he noted the practice of raising scars on the body among both Australian Aborigines and African tribes. He observed circumcision among Jews and Arabs, matrilineal marriage restrictions among the Iroquois, and the practice of dropping words from a language when they matched the names of the dead, as seen among the Abipones of South America. These parallel inventions prove to him that human culture evolves independently in similar ways.
In 1871, Tyler published his most recognized and influential book, Primitive Culture. This work is regarded as an anthropological classic that truly marks the beginning of the scientific study of culture. In it, he provided a definition of culture that is still taught today. He wrote, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habit acquired by man as a member of society." Looking closely at that famous definition, the word acquired is absolutely key. By using this word, Tyler emphasized that culture is the product of social learning, not biological heredity. This meant that differences in cultural development were due to progress in shared knowledge, not innate biological differences. Furthermore, by calling culture a complex whole, he insisted that every facet of social life, every socially learned behavior, no matter how trivial it might seem, was worthy of scientific study because it contributed to our understanding of mankind. In Primitive Culture, Tyler also looked at material relics to reconstruct history. Working alongside archaeologists and geologists, he examined artifacts found in different geological strata. By correlating these surviving material relics with their chronological sequence, he observed that the evolution of material culture passed through 3 successive stages: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. His heavy reliance on the doctrine of survivals and the comparative method earned him the title of the founder of comparative ethnology. While Tyler reconstructed many cultural institutions, his most comprehensive treatment was in the field of primitive religion. He defined religion simply and broadly as the belief in spiritual beings. Because no known culture was without such beliefs, he declared religion a cultural universal. According to Tyler, the most ancient form of religion was animism, derived from the word anima, meaning soul. He argued that all religion originated from this fundamental belief in the soul. To trace the origins of these beliefs, Tyler studied myths and legends, coining the term savage philosopher to describe early humans. He argued that primitive man observed the stark difference between a living person and a dead one. They rationally deduced that some unseen spirit inside the person enabled them to speak, walk, and breathe. When that spirit left the body, the person died. Though they lacked modern scientific knowledge, these savage philosophers were using reason to explain their experiences, leading to the invention of the soul concept. This primitive reasoning led to the conception of 2 identical ideas of the soul. First was the body soul, which was responsible for physical life and left the body permanently at death. Second was the ghost soul, which was seen as a phantom, an image, or a second self. Because people would see distant or deceased loved ones in their dreams, they reasoned that this ghost soul could travel outside the body and continue to exist even after physical death. From these early stages of animism, Tyler identified 3 general beliefs concerning the existence of ghost souls after death. First, the belief that souls hover around the earth, taking an interest in the living and visiting former homes. Second, metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls into other humans, animals, or objects. And third, the idea of a special residence in another world, like the heavens or an underworld. This third belief split into the continuance theory, where the afterlife is just like earthly life, and the retribution theory, where souls are rewarded or punished based on their earthly deeds. The idea that ghost souls animated the world naturally led to a higher order of spiritual beings, which Tyler called manes. These were souls that acquired special qualities, elevating them to the status of demons or deities. If the soul belonged to a parent, this led to ancestor worship. If it belonged to a powerful tribal chief or hero, it became a powerful spirit for good or evil. This distinction gave rise to the concepts of benevolent and malevolent spirits, and the active practice of offering worship. Another major feature in the development of primitive religion was the idea that spirits could be embodied or incarnated. This led directly to the concept of spirit possession. To deal with invading demon spirits, early societies developed the practice of exorcism as a therapeutic device. Exorcists would attempt to remove the unwanted spirits using various methods, including cajolery, bribes, threats, or persuading the spirit to drive itself into another abode. Related to spirit possession is fetishism, a term Tyler used to indicate a subordinate department of animism. He restricted the use of this term to spirits embodied in material objects, whether living or non-living. Fetishism merges into idolatry when a worshiper physically alters a fetish object to specifically serve as a home for a spirit. According to Tyler, idolatry is simply the embodiment of a soul in an idol, mirroring how a soul is embodied in a human. As animism developed, early humans began to draw analogies between their own behavior and the behavior of nature at large. Just as a human body functioned because of its ghost soul, they reasoned that natural phenomena, like the wind blowing or volcanoes erupting, were caused by natural spirits. Over time, these highly specific nature spirits became generalized into powerful deities governing entire domains, like gods of the sky, sea, agriculture, or war. This progression marks the great stage of polytheism. Finally, following the unilinear processes of cultural evolution, this polytheistic stage reached monotheism. The concept of one supreme deity came into existence. Tyler cited examples like Brahma Parmeshwar in Hindu society, regarded as the supreme being who commands all of nature, men, and other gods. Thus, Tyler argued that monotheism, which he viewed as the great belief of civilized people, evolved directly and logically from the primitive past belief of animism. Tyler's analysis of primitive religion was both highly appreciated and heavily criticized. He was praised for his massive collection of ethnographic materials and his clear, illustrative examples. His definition of religion as a cultural universal was widely accepted. However, critics alleged that he sometimes used meaningless data out of context. More importantly, they argued he failed to look at religious systems as a whole, focusing instead on selected aspects. Because he treated early religion purely as the rational exercise of logician, the vital social character and community function of religion remained largely unexplained in his work. Moving to his fourth book, published in 1881 and simply titled Anthropology, Tyler dealt with the continuity of cultural history. He used comparative methods to show how mankind reached civilization from savagery and barbarism. Importantly, he didn't view these stages as strict, unbreakable laws, but rather as empirical generalizations that helped ethnographers understand cultural continuity. This book is notable for its holistic four-field approach, which became particularly strong in America, incorporating physical anthropology, linguistics, archaeology, and cultural studies. In 1889, Tyler published a groundbreaking essay that applied statistical methods to the development of institutions. By sending out questionnaires and analyzing data from 282 societies, he correlated postmarital residence patterns with customs like in-law avoidance. This led him to conclude that matrilineal societies actually preceded patrilineal ones. He supported this by analyzing the custom of the kuvad, where a father takes to bed during the birth of his child. Tyler argued this was a survival from an intermediate stage where men needed to symbolically establish their paternity and authority over women as society transitioned toward patrilineality. Because Tyler relied heavily on data collected by travelers, missionaries, and colonial administrators, he is often labeled an armchair anthropologist, someone who reconstructs history from a desk rather than visiting the field. While it's true he only spent a short time in the Americas, he was not uncritical of his sources. He rigorously tested their accuracy using the comparative method. Furthermore, he recognized the absolute necessity of scientifically oriented fieldwork and was instrumental in founding organizations that trained his students to collect better ethnographic data. Tyler's influence extended deeply into the next generation, notably through his student R.R. Moret. In 1909, Moret published The Threshold of Religion, where he critically engaged with his teacher's theories. Moret transformed Tyler's concept of animism. He argued that before early humans believed in distinct, individualized souls, their destiny was guided by a belief in a generalized, impersonal power behind all material objects and natural phenomena. Moret termed this pre-animistic stage animatism. Shifting our focus to another major figure of the evolutionary school, we look at Sir Henry Maine. Born in 1822, Maine was a legal scholar who founded comparative jurisprudence in England. He held professorships at both Cambridge and Oxford, and his study of primitive law even took him to India, where he became the vice-chancellor of Calcutta University in 1869. He published several highly influential books on ancient laws and customs, most notably his 1861 masterpiece, Ancient Law.
Maine's major contribution to cultural evolutionary theory was his perspective on the development of the family system. Unlike Tyler, Morgan, and others who believed the earliest societies were matriarchal, Maine argued that the family in its original form was strictly patrilineal and patriarchal. Because he was a specialist in Roman law, he noted that changes in law were not always made manifest. Older forms continued to exist as legal fictions. By treating these legal fictions as survivals of earlier times, Maine traced the evolution of society from kinship-based groups to territorial organizations, setting the stage for further debates on social evolution.
Continuing our exploration of evolutionary anthropology, let's delve into Henry Maine's methodology. In his book Ancient Law, Maine wanted to examine the earliest ideas of mankind and see how they related to modern thought, specifically focusing on the evolution of law in the Western world. But he faced a major hurdle. How do you study the laws of people before the invention of writing? Maine's solution was a method of reconstruction, using what he called legal fictions. As a Roman law specialist, he noticed that changes in law weren't always explicitly made. Instead, older forms continued to exist as legal fictions. Maine viewed these fictions as survivals from earlier times, when they were actual functioning laws, allowing him to reconstruct the past. Using this method of reconstruction, Maine identified several key sequences of social and legal development. He argued that societies evolved from kinship-based organizations to territorial organizations. He also noted a shift from civil and criminal law being confounded, where injuries were compensated by agreements between families, to a system where crimes against society were separated from individual injuries. Crucially, Maine argued that the fundamental unit of ancient society was the family, whereas the unit of modern society is the individual. This meant the movement of progressive societies was characterized by the gradual dissolution of family dependency and the growth of individual obligation. To support his hypothesis that the earliest form of family was patriarchal and patrilineal, Maine cited the Roman law concept of patria potestas. This legal fiction implied that a father had absolute despotic power over his wife, children, servants, and even held the power of life and death over them. Now, in the historical periods where documentation actually existed, Roman fathers did not possess such extreme powers. Therefore, Maine reasoned, this legal fiction must be a survival from a much earlier time. From this, he concluded that the patriarchal family, ruled by a despotic father, was the earliest form of family organization, and these primeval families eventually aggregated to form larger groups. Maine expressed this movement from family dependency to individual obligation through a very famous dichotomy, the shift from status to contract. In a family-organized society, an individual's position is fixed by their status at birth, and property is owned in common by the family unit. In contrast, an individual organized society is based on free contract, where individuals negotiate their own relationships and obligations, which coincides with the growth of private ownership. This transition from status to contract remains one of Maine's most enduring contributions to legal and anthropological theory. However, Maine's evolutionary theory was not without its flaws, and it faced heavy criticism from contemporary anthropologists. The primary charge was that Maine had virtually no knowledge of actual ethnography. While he was an expert in ancient law, he lacked a deep understanding of the diverse races of mankind. He based his theories almost entirely on texts from Europe and India, yet he presented his scheme as if it were universally valid for all of humanity. Critics like John Ferguson McLennan attacked Maine, arguing that Maine's failed to prove why human beings couldn't have been grouped on a principle even more primitive than the patriarchal system. This brings us perfectly to John Ferguson McLennan. Born in Scotland in 1827, McLennan, like Maine, was a lawyer by profession, but his specific interest lay in the evolution of the institution of marriage. He published two highly influential books, Primitive Marriage in 1865 and Studies in Ancient History in 1876. McLennan is often credited as the first to seriously attempt reconstructing the social conditions of primitive people. He was much better read in ethnographic literature than Maine, and he firmly believed that the customs of contemporary so-called rude societies were direct survivals of early sociocultural conditions.
McLennan's major reconstruction centered around the concept of bride capture. He noticed that in several contemporary societies, marriage ceremonies involved mock battles. For instance, among the Kalmucks, the groom would pay a bride price and then carry the girl away on a horse amidst a scene of struggling and mock resistance. Similarly, among the Welsh, the groom's friends would engage in a mock battle with the bride's friends. McLennan postulated that these ceremonial mock battles were survivals of a time when women were actually captured by force. But why would women need to be captured? McLennan arrived at a logical conclusion. There must have been a severe shortage of brides. To explain the shortage of brides, McLennan pointed to the practice of female infanticide. He argued that early human populations lived under incredibly harsh conditions, facing intense struggles for existence. In a meager subsistence economy, immature women were seen as a burden. Therefore, primitive people practiced female infanticide, not out of mere cruelty, but as a functional necessity for group survival. This practice necessarily resulted in an unfavorable sex ratio, with far more men than women. This shortage of women led directly to the practice of bride capture, and eventually to polyandry, a marriage system where several men share a common wife. Based on this, McLennan outlined a specific sequence of social evolution. He argued that the earliest stage of society was one of sexual promiscuity, where marriage and kinship did not exist at all. Because paternity was impossible to recognize, the first form of kinship had to be matrilineal, reckoned only through the female line. The next stage was a slightly more regulated form of promiscuity, polyandry. It was only later, through specific forms of polyandry, that patrilineal descent, reckoning kinship through males, finally came into existence. Let's look closer at how polyandry led to patrilineal descent. McLennan identified two types of polyandry: Nair, or non-fraternal, where husbands are unrelated, and Tibetan, or fraternal polyandry, where the husbands are brothers. In fraternal polyandry, the woman had to live in the camp of the brothers. Over time, the oldest brother assumed responsibility for all the children, effectively becoming the legal father, and children inherited from him rather than the mother. This shifted kinship from female to male reckoning. McLennan argued that even where fraternal polyandry was no longer practiced, its former existence was proven by the survival of the levirate, the custom where a younger brother is obliged to marry his deceased older brother's wife. So how did society eventually arrive at monogamy? According to McLennan, the turning point was the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. With agriculture, subsistence became less precarious. Because survival was easier, female infanticide could be abandoned, which allowed the sex ratio to even out. At the same time, agricultural land made property and inheritance a major focus of concern. The best solution to ensure clear inheritance was monogamy, because it definitively solved the relationship of children to both their parents. Thus, the patriarchal monogamous family evolved out of earlier matriarchal stages. Interestingly, while McLennan and the American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan independently agreed on the early stages of promiscuity and the priority of matrilineal descent, they were bitter critics of each other. McLennan tried to destroy Morgan's theory of kinship terminology, asserting that classificationary terms were just modes of address with no bearing on actual descent. Morgan, in turn, successfully exposed McLennan's confusion regarding exogamy and endogamy, pointing out that exogamous clans exist within endogamous tribes. Morgan also corrected McLennan's erroneous assumption that matrilineal descent was the only early mode of reckoning, proving the existence of bilateral kinship. Now we turn to the last survivor of British classical anthropology, Sir James George Fraser. Born in Glasgow in 1854, Fraser spent most of his academic life at Trinity College, Cambridge. His interest in anthropology was sparked by E.B. Tyler's Primitive Culture and the mentorship of William Robertson Smith. Fraser was incredibly prolific. He started with articles on taboo and totemism for the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1888, but he is best known for his monumental work, The Golden Bough, which eventually expanded to 12 volumes. He also wrote extensively on classical Greece, folklore in the Old Testament, and the worship of nature. Despite his massive contributions, Fraser was the quintessential armchair anthropologist. He was a man of monumental learning, but he never conducted field studies himself. He had no first-hand acquaintance with the primitive people he wrote about. Instead, he relied entirely on secondary sources: classic literature, folklore, and reports from missionaries and travelers. To gather data, he even sent out a pamphlet of questions to guide field workers. Fraser utilized the comparative method, assuming that all men are substantially similar and develop through the same evolutionary stages. For Fraser, the concept of survivals, where a flourishing belief at one level becomes a mere superstition in the next, was the essential key to understanding this evolution. Fraser's evolutionary principle focused primarily on the mental progress of mankind.
He viewed civilization as extremely complex and savagery as comparatively simple, making savagery the best starting point to understand human origins. In The Golden Bough, Fraser depicted an epic of humanity passing through 3 successive stages of mental development. Humanity started in the stage of magic, moved into the stage of religion, and finally attained the ripe age of science. He was essentially addicted to psychological interpretations, viewing these stages through the lens of individual human belief and practice. Before we look at magic, let's examine Fraser's views on totemism. Fraser defined a totem as a class of material objects that a clan regards with superstition, believing they share an intimate, special relationship. In his 1910 work, Totemism and Exogamy, he theorized that totemism originated from a belief in the soul. He argued that early humans believed the souls of dead persons took up residence in plants, trees, or animals. Consequently, they began to respect these objects, making it taboo to eat or kill them. He cited the Arunta tribe of Australia, who believed totems were responsible for causing pregnancy, suggesting that totemism initially came into being from the female side rather than the male. Returning to his main evolutionary scheme, Fraser explained that early man knew nothing of science or natural causes. Instead, they tried to control nature through magic, which Fraser called a bastard sister of science. This magic was based on 2 erroneous principles. The first is the law of similarity, or homeopathic magic, which presumes that like produces like. Magicians believed they could control nature by imitating it, like pouring water to summon rain or using a voodoo doll. The second is the law of contact, or contagious magic, which posits that things once in contact remain connected even after separation. This is why a magician might burn someone's hair or nail clippings, believing the harm would transfer to the original owner. But human minds progressed. People eventually realized that their magical laws did not always work, and they were fairly helpless to control nature by their own efforts alone. From this realization, religion was born. The conviction arose that higher, supernatural powers govern the universe. The old magicians transitioned into religious specialists, using their supposed ability to contact and persuade these spirits to gain prestige, eventually becoming divine kings. Finally, humanity reached the scientific stage. Science, Fraser noted, is closely related to magic because man once again tries to manipulate nature by his own skills, but this time he is equipped with correct, rational laws. While Fraser's epic narrative in The Golden Bough was fascinating, it faced severe criticism. Fraser depicted early men as highly irrational beings, moving neatly from one distinct stage to the next. However, these rigid stages cannot be found in ethnographic reality. As the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski later demonstrated through his fieldwork, magic, religion, and science actually coexist. For example, the Trobriand islanders used magic rituals to help their crops grow, but they simultaneously carried out all the rational, scientific agricultural tasks necessary for production. Non-literate people were not wholly ignorant of natural causation. As we can see, while the British classical anthropologists like Maine, MacLennan, and Fraser laid the foundational groundwork for evolutionary theory, their reliance on armchair methods and rigid stages left them vulnerable to critiques based on actual ethnographic reality. To see how evolutionary thought developed with a closer tie to fieldwork, we must shift our focus across the Atlantic to the American evolutionary school. In our next section, we will begin by examining the life and work of Lewis Henry Morgan, a New York lawyer whose close first-hand contact with the Iroquois Indians fundamentally changed the study of kinship. Continuing our exploration of evolutionary thought, we turn to a pivotal figure, Lewis Henry Morgan. Born in New York in 1818, Morgan was a lawyer who became deeply fascinated by the Iroquois Indians. He even formed a fraternal society called the Grand Order of the Iroquois. His perspective shifted dramatically when he met Ely Parker, a Seneca Indian and fellow law student. Parker delivered a powerful speech to Morgan's society about the miserable, exploited conditions of his people. Moved by this, Morgan helped Parker in legal struggles over land rights and realized that Native American cultures were rapidly changing and needed to be recorded. This led to his 1851 book, League of the Iroquois, considered the first true account of a Native American tribe. While studying the Iroquois, Morgan became fascinated by their government and family organization, particularly their system of naming relatives. He noticed something that seemed highly unusual to a 19th century American. An Iroquois child called their mother's sister's mother and their father's brother's father. The children of 2 or more sisters called each other brother and sister. Morgan termed this a classificationary kinship system, which he contrasted with the descriptive kinship system used in Western societies. Initially, he thought this was a unique Iroquois invention, but he soon discovered that the Ojibwa Indians possessed a very similar system. This discovery sparked a massive hypothesis. Morgan reasoned that it was highly unlikely such a specific kinship system could be invented twice. Therefore, if this system was universal among all American Indians, it would prove a unity of origin. Furthermore, if the same system existed in Asia, it would prove that American Indians were Asiatic in origin. To test this, Morgan pioneered a massive data collection effort. He created a 7-page questionnaire with over 200 questions, and with the help of the Smithsonian Institution, mailed it to diplomats and missions all over the world. When the data returned, it revealed that Tamils in India also used a classificatory kinship system, convincing Morgan that his Asiatic origin hypothesis was correct. Morgan published his exhaustive data and analysis in his 1870 book, System of Consanguinity and Affinity of Human Family. The reception was highly polarized. Later anthropologists like Mayer Fortes praised it as a golden vein for scientific mining in the human sciences. However, contemporaries were critical. The British evolutionist MacLennan argued that Morgan completely misunderstood kinship terms, largely because MacLennan believed patrilineality preceded matrilineality, whereas Morgan argued the opposite. Furthermore, Lord Avebury pointed out a major flaw in Morgan's Asiatic origin theory. Morgan's own data showed that classificatory systems existed in Australia and Polynesia, begging the question of why American Indians had to originate specifically in Asia. Morgan's theoretical framework underwent a massive shift thanks to a Sanskrit scholar named Joshua McIlvaine. McIlvaine pointed out that the widespread occurrence of the classification system didn't merely indicate an Asiatic origin. Rather, it proved that all primitive groups who used it were related, and that this system represented an earlier stage of human development. This was a profound realization. McIlvaine urged Morgan to read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Prior to this, Morgan believed in the divine creation of man. After reading Darwin, Morgan changed his mind, adopting the evolutionary conclusion that humanity started at the bottom of the scale and worked its way up. This evolutionary perspective culminated in Morgan's monumental 1877 book, Ancient Society. In it, he envisioned human history as consisting of 3 major ethnical periods: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. To provide a more granular framework, he divided the first 2 periods, savagery and barbarism, into lower, middle, and upper subperiods. Crucially, Morgan defined these ethnical periods and their subdivisions by a specific sequence of technological innovations, linking the material progress of a society directly to its cultural and social stage. Let's look at how Morgan defined the stages of savagery. Lower savagery was characterized by the very beginnings of humanity, the invention of speech, and a diet relying on foraging for fruits and nuts. Middle savagery was marked by the utilization of fire and the ability to subsist on fish, which allowed early humans to migrate along coastlines and rivers. Upper savagery was defined by a major leap in hunting technology, the invention of the bow and arrow. Moving into barbarism, lower barbarism was defined by the invention of pottery. Middle barbarism showed geographic variation. In the Old World, it was marked by the domestication of animals, while in the New World, it was defined by the cultivation of maize using irrigation, along with adobe and stone brick architecture. Upper barbarism was characterized by the crucial development of iron smelting and iron tools. Finally, the stage of civilization was reached with the invention of the phonetic alphabet and writing. Unlike Edward Tyler, who spoke of these stages in broad, general terms, Morgan assigned specific, known cultures to these various stages of development. For example, he categorized Australians and most Polynesians as being in middle savagery, while placing the Homeric Greeks and ancient Italians in upper barbarism. Morgan believed each period had a distinct culture. He didn't just look at tools. He correlated these technological stages with sequences of family organization, kinship terminology, descent patterns, and rules of property inheritance, noting that concepts of property and descriptive kinship emerged relatively late. However, Morgan's system had significant weaknesses. His major flaw was confusing synchronic and diachronic reconstructions. He extrapolated from living cultures, assuming that contemporary non-literate societies were accurate total reflections of the ancient past. This led to faulty correlations that could be disproven by ethnographic data. For instance, Hawaiians had a kinship system Morgan considered early, yet they possessed highly developed agriculture, stratification, and complex government. Similarly, the Aztecs had a state government and a system of writing, hallmarks of civilization, but they lacked iron smelting, which Morgan insisted was a prerequisite in upper barbarism. In spite of severe criticism, Morgan made substantial and enduring contributions to anthropology. His terminology attracted scholars to study kinship, resulting in thousands of publications. He set a powerful example for first-hand fieldwork and empirical data collection. Implicitly, he recognized cultures as functional wholes, seeing how institutions like architecture, family, and technology interrelated. While modern anthropologists have dropped the offensive terms savagery and barbarism, they still generally accept his historical sequence, moving from hunting and gathering to domestication, and finally to writing and civilization. A major theoretical debate of the time involved explaining why different cultures developed similar traits. Morgan argued for psychic unity, reasoning that all humans possessed certain germ ideas that served as the basis for parallel development. He believed the human mind worked in uniform channels. Tyler agreed that mental processes were essentially similar everywhere, and that basic similarities weren't just due to diffusion. But the dilemma remained. When you find a specific trait, like metallurgy or the Indian game pâtisserie, in widely separated groups, was it independently invented time after time, or did it spread from a single origin through diffusion?
This debate had profound implications regarding the issue of progress versus degeneration. Some anthropologists argued that so-called savage groups were actually degenerated and could only progress under the influence of more advanced people, meaning through diffusion. To combat this, Tyler had to push for independent invention, or evolution, to prove that these societies could progress on their own merits. In reality, neither Tyler nor Morgan argued exclusively for one side. They often ignored instances of diffusion for the sake of psychic unity, using whichever explanation fit the evidence they were trying to present.
Unfortunately, Morgan and Tyler sometimes resorted to racist explanations for unsynchronized evolutionary development. Morgan went beyond diffusion, arguing that certain family types were transmitted with the blood, and claimed Native Americans lacked a profit motive. Tyler compared civilized morality against what he called dull-minded barbarians. Both shared social Darwinist notions prevalent in their time, applying the survival of the fittest dogma to culture. They assigned Victorian England and America to the highest stages of evolution, imposing a moralistic bias that hindered truly objective scholarly inquiry into how cultures actually change. Interestingly, Morgan's evolutionary scheme had a massive impact outside of anthropology, specifically on Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx bought a copy of Ancient Society and found in it a confirmation of his own materialistic conception of history. Morgan's theory aligned perfectly with Marx's concepts because Morgan made economic production, how people get their food and the tools they use, the basic factors determining the course of history. After Marx died, Engels used Morgan's research to publish The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State in 1884, introducing Morgan's definite order of primitive history to a much wider audience. Shifting our focus to the continental evolutionists, we encounter John Jacob Bachhofen. Like Morgan, Bachhofen was a lawyer by training. Based in Switzerland, he surveyed Greek classical writings and early ethnographic literature. He noticed that in early societies, children were often named after their mothers. This led him to a core hypothesis that directly opposed some of his contemporaries. He argued that matrilineality, and indeed matriarchy, must have preceded patriarchy. He detailed this theory in his 1861 book, Das Mutterrecht, or Mother Right, outlining a specific sequence of development. Bachhofen proposed 3 main stages of development. The first stage he called heterism, which was characterized by sexual promiscuity or sexual communism. In this early period, he argued, women were treated merely as sex objects. Because mating was random, it was impossible to know the real father of a child, meaning kinship lines and descent had to be traced exclusively through the mother. Bachhofen deduced the existence of this stage from what he considered survivals in later cultures, such as the practice of temple prostitution. The second stage was gynocracy, or mother right. Bachhofen theorized that women eventually revolted against their submissive status in the heterism stage, ushering in a period of Amazonian assertiveness. In this stage, females ruled the world. Female deities were worshipped, and society was dominated by maternal symbolism. The female left side was raised in dignity over the male right side. The moon, because it regulated menstruation, was considered more important than the sun. The earth ruled over the ocean, and darkness was revered over light. Eventually, according to Bachhofen, society transitioned to the third stage, patriarchy. Men strove to overthrow the female reign. Initially, men pretended they too could give birth, inventing the couvade, a custom where a father goes to bed as if in labor to claim equality with the mother. Ultimately, men succeeded in establishing dominance, rising to a higher principle of religion based on the spirit and fatherhood.
This resulted in a complete reversal of symbolism. Patriarchy reversed all former symbols, so the sun now ruled the moon, and heavenly light prevailed over the darkness of the earth. Taking Bachofen, Maine, and McLennan together, we see a shared reliance on what became known as the historical method. Their goal was to reconstruct the total panorama of human history, showing that human culture had undergone progressive, cumulative growth. Because written documentation for early stages was lacking, they relied heavily on the comparative method and the concept of survivals. By looking at cultural items or practices that were no longer functional but had meaning in the past, they believed they could deduce the conditions of earlier periods and establish evolutionary sequences. As we look toward other foundational figures, we must note Adolf Bastian, a German ethnographer who strongly championed the principle of psychic unity. Unlike the evolutionists we've just discussed, Bastian was a strict empiricist. He actually criticized and rejected the biological evolutionary theories of both Lamarck and Darwin, arguing simply that no one had ever actually seen one species change into another. His focus on empirical data and psychic unity provides a crucial contrast as we continue to map out the landscape of early anthropological thought. Moving straight into another major figure of the era, Adolf Bastian approached the history of culture by focusing heavily on the similarities between different types of people, rather than their differences. He believed these similarities existed because of the psychic unity of mankind. According to Bastian, there is a restricted number of basic ideas common to all humans. He called these elementary thought patterns Elementargonden. However, because humans live in different environments, these universal ideas take on specific localized expressions, which he termed Völkergonden, or folk ideas. Bastian noticed that areas sharing similar folk ideas formed what he called geographical provinces. This was actually a highly progressive concept that foreshadowed the later American idea of culture areas. Unlike some of his rigid contemporaries, Bastian gladly admitted that these provinces never remained pure. He recognized that migration and the diffusion of ideas constantly introduced new cultural traits. Because he accounted for this mixing, Bastian was far better aware of the sheer complexity of cultural evolution than many other 19th century evolutionists. Despite his brilliant insights, Bastian's writings are virtually unknown to present-day anthropologists, and there is a good reason for this. His writing style was notoriously confused, obscure, ornate, and often untranslatable. However, his practical contributions were massive. As a well-traveled scholar, he collected countless objects of material culture, which led to the establishment of the Museum für Völkerkunde in Berlin. He also co-founded the German Society for Anthropology and launched a major scientific journal, cementing his institutional legacy in the field. Seriously, now, before we dismantle the classical evolutionary theory, we must acknowledge its undeniable contributions. These scholars tried their absolute best to explore and analyze cultural processes as a whole. They synthesized massive amounts of literature from travelers and missionaries to reconstruct human history. When written records failed, they pioneered the use of cultural survivals to piece together the past. Most importantly, their historical and comparative approach is still accepted today as a vital method for understanding present cultures in relation to their past. Despite those contributions, classical evolutionary theory was subjected to intense criticism. The first major critique is that these evolutionists almost exclusively tried to show the independent evolution of cultures. They assumed every culture passed through the exact same sequence, stage after stage, in total isolation. This resulted in a severely one-sided explanation of human history. This rigid, unilinear analysis was their greatest weakness, and it made them a prime target for later anthropologists, particularly the diffusionists, who argued that cultures do not evolve in a vacuum. The second criticism targets the evolutionary assumption that similar cultural traits always stem from similar causes. Human history clearly shows that entirely different cultures can emerge within the exact same geographical environment. Conversely, different environments naturally push cultural development in different directions. For example, look at the institution of polygynous marriage. In one society, it may have originated simply due to a demographic surplus of women, but in another society, it existed purely as a mechanism of social prestige and wealth. Same cultural trait, entirely different causes. The third major criticism shatters the idea of a universal sequence of economic development. Evolutionists claim that all mankind universally progressed from hunting and gathering to animal domestication to agriculture and finally to industry.
But archaeological and historical research simply does not support this. We cannot safely say this sequence was similar for all societies. The most glaring proof is that hunting and gathering did not just vanish, it still exists today among societies that live concurrently with industrial nations.
Furthermore, real-world evidence shows that these supposed evolutionary sequences can be completely broken by external situations. For instance, certain tribes in Africa practice agriculture but never passed through the stage of animal domestication. They jumped straight from hunting and gathering to farming, completely skipping the pastoral stage. Similarly, in India, the sudden establishment of modern factories turned many tribal hunter-gatherers directly into industrial laborers. They completely bypassed the agricultural stage. The sequence is not a rigid law, it is highly flexible.
Just as the economic stages were flawed, the fourth criticism attacks the supposed universal sequence of technological development: Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. While European evidence heavily supports this successive progression, it is absolutely not true for all societies. Evidence gathered from African countries indicates that much of Africa transitioned directly from the Stone Age into the Iron Age. Up to now, there is no proof of a Copper or Bronze Age existing there. This clearly reveals that evolutionary theories cannot force cultural processes into a single definite sequence.
The fifth criticism is methodological. The classical evolutionists were heavily criticized for adopting a very weak method of study. They were essentially armchair anthropologists. They almost never visited the field to actually observe the phenomena they wrote about. Instead, they relied completely on secondhand data gathered by untrained travelers and missionaries, rarely testing the reliability of this data before jumping to massive conclusions. They were so extreme in their desire to prove unilinear evolution that whenever they saw a similarity, they forcefully shoved it into their preconceived sequence.
This leads us to the sixth criticism, the complete disregard for cultural diffusion. Evolutionists were so biased by their belief in independent invention that they forgot that culture traits migrate. Culture is inherently dynamic, not static. Diffusionists rightly pointed out that a massive amount of cultural growth happens simply because different groups come into contact with one another. When they meet, they imitate each other. As a result, a single invention can diffuse across vast distances, rather than being independently invented over and over again.
Finally, the American diffusionist Golden Wieser added another crucial layer to this critique. He criticized the classical evolutionists not just for ignoring diffusion, but for neglecting the sheer importance of human discovery and invention. The evolutionists treated human progress almost like a biological inevitability, a clockwork sequence. But Golden Wieser argued that culture is fundamentally an active invention or discovery made by human beings through social means. It requires agency, creativity, and social interaction, not just passive progression through predetermined stages.
To wrap up our discussion on the evolutionary school of anthropology, while these early thinkers laid the crucial groundwork for the comparative study of cultures, their theories were ultimately constrained by fatal flaws. They wrongly assumed that all societies march independently through the exact same unilinear stages of economic and technological development. By relying on armchair analysis rather than actual fieldwork, they completely missed the messy, dynamic reality of human history, a reality driven by environmental differences, unique human inventions, and the constant widespread diffusion of ideas.